Chapter 12. The Soul Taker's Mission. Joe didn't know how to react to what Karen had said, and it was clear that Karen was waiting for a reaction. All Joe could do was stand there, her face throbbing. After a second or so, she finally uttered a simple, "What?" "We're here for your soul," Karen replied. "That's a soul in the plural sense, by the way. Our leader seeks a number of special souls. He wishes to possess their unique energy for himself. He scouted you and your dueling hearts as potential bearers of those souls. You were sent to confirm his suspicions, and, if he turned out to be right, to take your souls from you." Joe felt like she'd been smacked in the face, now metaphorically as well as literally. Her head felt foggy, but that wasn't the reason why nothing that Karen was saying was making any sense. She had heard of people blocking the flow of soul within others, or siphoning soul off from their opponent to weaken them, but Karen didn't seem to be talking about that. She seemed to mean that she intended to take the core souls, the sources of their soul energy, from Joe and her friends, which was impossible, and she said as much. "You can't take away a person's soul," she told Karen. "That's not possible." "Our leader can," Karen countered insistently, "but because his movements as of late are, let's say, limited, he has to rely on his allies to seek out strong souls for him." Lawrence removed a metal amulet from his pocket and held it up for Joe to see, a nasty grin spreading across his face. The amulet glowed faintly. "Our leader has the ability to share powers with others, or even with some objects," Karen explained. "He allowed us to borrow his technique for identifying those with the souls that he's looking for, and he put his power to take the souls from others into this artifact. It'll store your souls until we return them to him. Others within our organization," Monty explained, "will take the souls of any strong opponent that our leader sends them to assess as an offering to him, even if they don't turn out to be what our leader is looking for. But the three of us avoid doing that whenever possible. You four were just unlucky enough to actually have the souls in question. Or some of them, anyway." "This doesn't make any sense," Joe stammered. "Everyone's soul starts out the same and only changes based on who they are. Everyone's soul is just as special as everyone else's. Even if you could take the soul from someone, that doesn't explain why you would want to." "You don't need to know the specifics," Karen told Joe, sounding almost sympathetic. "All you need to know is that the three of us intend to be as delicate as we can. Even Lawrence wouldn't just kill you for no reason. You'll most definitely survive the process, and because of the unique nature of your four souls, you may even be able to develop soul all over again and regain some of your former strength one day." Karen looked over at Lawrence and nodded. He stepped forward, and it hit Joe for the first time that these three were absolutely serious about this. Even injured, with her stamina depleted, Joe could feel that there was power in the amulet that Lawrence held. She reacted on instinct, stepping back into a back stance. Energy crackled in the air around her as her body settled into position. Lawrence's only reaction was another of his broad, intimidating smiles. He saw that she intended to fight, and that excited him. Joe would, of course, fight. If there was even a chance that the Soul Takers might actually be able to live up to their name, and that it might kill her and her friends, Joe would fight, no matter how hurt she was, until she couldn't fight anymore. She'd fight all three Soul Takers if she had to, and she could see in that moment that they were prepared to make her if that's what she chose. And so, because she saw no other option, she made that choice. Joe felt her energies churning within her as she focused on mixing them together and building them up. Her life energy flared alongside her soul energy, alleviating some of the pain that she was feeling, and she bore down on her soul energy and wrapped herself in it. As weak as she was at this point, her aura was so small that it could barely be seen, but it was all that she had. She planted her feet firmly, contemplating whether she should make the first move, but she was saved from additional pain when a new voice lent itself to the conversation. "What's going on out here? You're making near enough noise to wake the dead, which just happens to be barely enough to wake an old man like me." Joe turned, along with the Soul Takers, toward the source of the sound. Standing in the open back door of his dojo was Wilson himself, dressed in a robe, carrying a straight wooden cane that Joe knew he sometimes carried when he had to leave the dojo for an extended period of time. Joe couldn't breathe. She'd forgotten why she and the other dueling hearts had agreed to fight the Soul Takers in the first place. Now she was reminded, and there was nothing she could do to protect Wilson any longer if the Soul Takers decided to use him for further leverage. "Will," Joe said, trying to hide how desperate she felt, "go back inside. Let me handle this." Wilson smiled at her, then looked at the other dueling hearts still lying on the ground nearby. Joe took his meaning. She hadn't been able to handle things so far. What made her think anything had changed? "That doesn't mean that you can do anything that we couldn't," Joe thought, but she had enough respect for the man to refrain from saying it out loud. Instead, she looked the old man in the eyes and said, "These three are dangerous, Will. They don't want you. They just want us. Just go back inside." Wilson walked over to her, and he looked over her broken nose carefully. "I have this dojo for a reason, young lady," he said. "I can handle myself." He reached up, and with a swift twist, he popped the cartilage in her nose back into place. Then his hand glowed, and he gripped her nose hard. so hard that she almost blacked out from the pain and pressure. But when his hand came away, most of the pain was gone. Without another word, Wilson turned away from Joe and stood between her and the Soul Takers. He planted his cane firmly in front of him. All of a sudden, it was as if he was a different person. Joe took an involuntary step back. She could feel an intense wave of soul pouring from her mentor's frail body. Looking past him at the Soul Takers, she could see that they felt it as well. Monty and Lawrence looked at each other with varying levels of concern and confusion. Karen kept her eyes fixed on Wilson, but the calm smile that had accompanied her since her first direct interaction with the Dueling Hearts had faded from her face. "I know who you are," Wilson told Karen and her companions. "Or, rather, I know who you represent. I may be trapped in the frail body of an old man, but I know more about how to augment the human body with soul than almost anyone else alive. The three of you may have defeated those four." He gestured to Joe and the other Dueling Hearts. "And you may have done so relatively easily, but you can't fool me as easily as you can them. I can feel how worn out you are." Wilson looked at Joe. "Miss Seeger will fight at my side." He turned back to the Soul Takers. "You three can sense the power that I wield. Are you really confident that you can take both of us as you are now?" Joe was caught completely off guard. She'd never seen Wilson like this before. She knew that he had knowledge of soul, obviously. He had a dojo, and he had advised her many times on how to better focus her energies, something that was often difficult for someone with a soul like hers. But she never thought of him as threatening, or at all capable of fighting. Now he was threatening one of the most powerful fighters that Joe and her friends had ever seen, and his threats seemed to be giving those fighters pause. Karen in particular seemed to be really considering Wilson's words. Finally, after a pause of several long seconds, she looked Wilson right in the eye, and she asked, "What would you have us do? Our leader suspects that these four possess four of the souls that he seeks. Even if we lie, his quest for those special souls will lead him here again one day. It's much safer for us to do our job." "Your leader," Wilson inquired, "prefers that you bring him the most potent souls that you can, correct?" Karen nodded. "Then he would be forgiving of a delay if it meant bringing him special souls even stronger than the ones that these four possess here today." "That's true," Karen admitted. Joe could see from the look on her face that she was already beginning to follow Wilson's line of reasoning, but Joe herself was as confused as ever. "Then leave here," Wilson offered Karen, "and come back in 2 weeks. In that time, I'll train these four." "Making them stronger," Karen said, continuing his thought for him, "and making their souls stronger and therefore more worthwhile for our leader." "Except," Wilson said, a fierce edge to his voice, "you'll have to fight them again when you return. And if they've managed to get strong enough to beat you in those 2 weeks, you have to leave them in peace." "If you can train these 4 weaklings to beat us in only 2 weeks," Lawrence said, laughing, "then you might just be able to make that miracle come true, too." Karen looked over at Lawrence, and he fell quiet. She herself remained silent for a few more seconds. Joe could see the gears turning in her head as she worked something out. Joe found herself trying to read what Karen was thinking on her face. She almost thought that she could, too, that she could see Karen trying to come up with a way to use this situation to let Joe and her friends go. But that was just wishful thinking. Either way, Joe was so distracted waiting for Karen to answer that she didn't notice at first when her friends began to stir, one after another, as they shook off the unconsciousness brought about by their recent altercations. She kept her eyes on Karen. She almost couldn't tear them away. She didn't even realize that she'd been holding her breath until Karen spoke, saying, "I accept your terms." Joe's eyes darted to the other Soul Takers. Monty didn't seem disappointed by Karen's decision, but he also didn't seem particularly enthusiastic about it. Lawrence didn't seem necessarily disappointed either, but he didn't seem like he thought it was a good idea. He looked at Joe and Wilson like he might attack them on his own, but he restrained himself, eventually turning away from them completely. Karen turned away next, followed by Monty, and the three of them made to leave. As they did, Karen turned and looked over her shoulder, saying, 2 weeks. Use them well." Wilson continued to stand his ground, but Joe turned to her friends. They were all awake now. Tucker was up, and he was carrying himself well, ignoring his injuries. He reached down and he helped Sarah up. She was still so dazed that she didn't even mind leaning on him to avoid using her damaged leg. Joe rushed over to them and she helped Jen to stand up as well. "What happened?" Tucker asked. "Did you win?" Sarah asked, looking around. "And why is Wilson out here?" Joe opened her mouth to respond, but Wilson himself beat her to it. "That," he said, turning, finally, to look at the Dueling Hearts again, "is a very long story, and the 4 of you have had a long night. You're injured, in some cases quite seriously. I can alleviate the worst of that for you, but the 4 of you require rest and time to start recovering. Go home tonight and sleep. Come back here tomorrow and we'll sort everything out." Wilson said all of this with absolute authority, in a tone that commanded respect. This was a side of Wilson that Joe was familiar with. She had encountered this Wilson before during training. This was a Wilson that she could deal with. So, when the other Dueling Hearts looked to her for answers, despite Wilson's words, Joe said, "We'll do as he says. He somehow seems to know more about what's going on here than I do anyway." The other dueling hearts didn't seem to like her answer, but they were too tired to even think about arguing. They followed Wilson inside the dojo and allowed him to use some technique to reverse the greatest of the damage that had been done to them that night. It wasn't any kind of healing that they had encountered before, with the wounds ending up as if they had healed normally over time, but none of them complained or questioned it. Then they went home, and they slept the worst of the rest of it off. To Joe's surprise, considering all that she was feeling and her history with nightmares, sleep actually came easy to her that night. Even more surprising, though, was what Joe dreamed about. Rather than the nightmares that she was used to, her subconscious caught her off guard. That night, of all things, Joe dreamt of Karen, of her face and of her confident smile. She dreamt of the way that Karen walked, and the way that she moved when she fought, and of her eyes and her voice. She dreamt of how bad it had felt when Karen had finally told them what she and her allies wanted, but things never turned bleak. Every painful memory of Karen was quickly replaced by something endearing, like the way she had looked at Joe the few times that Joe had gotten the best of her. Joe awoke the next morning, feeling confused. She was still confused about all the things that the Soul Takers and Wilson had said. She was confused as to how Wilson had been able to heal her when her unnatural soul should have rejected his life energy and made healing her impossible for someone with his skills. Did he know the same technique that healers like her mom did, for moving an injured person's own life energy into the parts of their body that were hurt, patching them up enough to keep an injured person alive in a tough situation? If he did, he had never said so, and it certainly hadn't felt like that at the time. Then there were Joe's dreams, which put her even more off guard than her teacher's displays of power. Had her loss to Karen affected her so much? Why, then, had her dream left her feeling not shaken, not afraid, but content? She didn't have any answers, and even though talking with Wilson and straightening things out would not answer these fresh questions, any answers at this point would be welcome. Joe hopped up out of bed. She'd forgotten momentarily just how injured she was, and she winced when her muscles protested her movements. She had to take a few seconds to collect herself before she could stand up completely. She'd slept in her clothes, but they were too ripe and covered in blood to wear for a second day in a row, so she changed, then headed out into the hallway where she almost ran into Sarah. The two sisters just looked at each other for several seconds. Neither of them knew what to say, and they were each the kind of person who, when they didn't know what to say, they didn't speak. Finally, though, Sarah broke the silence. "I don't think we should tell Mom about any of this," she said. "At least not yet." Joe didn't even have to think about it. If their mom found out about the Soul Takers, she would insist on helping to fight them, and Joe and Sarah didn't want to put her in danger. So Joe nodded, and the two sisters walked together. They walked down the stairs together, they walked out of the house together, and they walked to Wilson's dojo together, all in complete silence.